Nebraska, 1944. The wind dragged snow like white sand across the barbed wire of Camp Atlanta. Inside the fences, a group of German prisoners stood in line, their breath turning to fog as a truck rolled in from the east. The soldiers unloading it wore heavy coats and laughter on their faces. What they carried looked absurd. Steel boxes glowing faintly in the cold, steam or maybe smoke rising from their seams. One German leaned to another and muttered, half mocking, half confused, "So this is victory. Cold food for cold hearts." The others chuckled. To them, it was proof of what they'd always believed. America was mechanical, soulless, obsessed with machines instead of men. But when the first lid opened, a burst of aroma spilled into the frozen air. Grilled beef, sweet corn, green beans, the unmistakable smell of warmth. The prisoners fell silent. One sniffed again, whispering in disbelief, "It smells like Sunday back home." The sound of ladles clinking replaced laughter. Somewhere behind the fence, a harmonica played faintly from a guard tower, the notes trembling with the wind. That moment, the shock of the senses, was America's quiet answer to ideology. These men had crossed oceans to fight against an image of industrial coldness. Yet here, in the heart of a continent they barely understood, machines had been used not for destruction, but preservation. The steel boxes were part of a vast new network. Mobile refrigeration units built in Chicago, powered by diesel compressors from General Electric. In 1944 alone, more than 1 million tons of frozen food traveled by rail to feed American troops, sailors, and yes, even their prisoners. It wasn't mercy born of weakness. It was logistics born of principle. No one left hungry, not even the defeated. The Germans didn't know it yet, but they were standing at the edge of a revolution that would outlast the war itself. Cold was being turned into care, and in that strange smell of roasted meat rising through frost, something invisible began to thaw. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. The next morning, frost still clung to the fences, but the smell of cooked food lingered over the camp like a ghost of comfort. A man in denim overalls arrived on a small army truck, stepping down with a gait that spoke of years behind a plow. His name was Harold Whitaker, a farmer from Kearney County, Nebraska, who had volunteered to deliver meat from his ranch. The German prisoners watched him unload crates of frozen beef stamped with a blue U.S. seal. One of them, Sergeant Franz Mueller, couldn't contain himself. "Why feed us so well?" he asked in English, his tone sharp, defensive, almost ashamed. Whitaker paused, wiped his hands on his gloves, and looked straight at him. "Because hunger makes beasts," he said quietly. "We're raising men again." It wasn't a speech. It was just a sentence, but it cut through the wire more sharply than any bullet. The prisoners exchanged glances. Some scoffed, others turned away. Yet something in the farmer's calm eyes unsettled them. Mueller, who had once lectured about the purity of strength, now found that simple words from a man who raised cattle felt heavier than propaganda. Whitaker's story mirrored millions of Americans working behind the front lines. In 1944, over 1,200 refrigerated plants operated across the United States, converting farmland harvests into frozen meals for soldiers stationed from Alaska to the Pacific. Each plant was part of an invisible front, a logistical army that fought not with rifles, but with temperature and timing. Later that evening, Mueller and his bunkmate, Ernst Vogel, dissected Whitaker's words in the dim light of their barrack. "Raising men again," Ernst repeated. "What does that mean to them?" Mueller shrugged. "Maybe they think food can wash away a war." But somewhere in that night of guarded pride, the sentence burrowed deeper. In Germany, food had been rationed, politicized, weaponized. Here, even prisoners were fed by the same supply chain that sustained soldiers. It wasn't equality, but it was a reminder that America's strength didn't come from cruelty. It came from abundance, and from the strange conviction that dignity should never freeze, even in wartime. The farmer left before dawn, his truck taillights fading into the gray horizon. Behind the fence, Mueller stood watching, a thought he couldn't quite form pressing against his chest. Maybe the war wasn't about who conquered land, but who understood hunger. By the end of that week, laughter in the mess hall had grown quieter. The Germans no longer mocked the trays of food that arrived each morning in their glistening metal containers. Still, the air carried an awkward silence, something unspoken, fragile. On the seventh day, Mueller lifted his spoon, tasted the mashed potatoes, and then put it down again. "We mocked their food," he murmured, "but it tastes of care." No one answered. Across the table, another prisoner swallowed hard, as if the flavor carried more than seasoning. For men raised to see enemies as inferior, this was unbearable nourishment. Each bite contradicted years of belief. The food was simple: frozen beef, canned peas, rehydrated milk, but it arrived hot, consistent, human. Even humiliation can be softened by warmth, but guilt lingers longer than hunger. In his diary, camp medic Dr. Karl Reinhardt wrote that day, "I cannot eat without thinking of the women in Stuttgart queuing for bread. Here our plates are full. It's indecent. Yet the Americans serve us as though we were guests, not captives." Outside, smoke rose from the camp's new kitchen unit, a prefabricated model built by the Quartermaster Corps. The Americans called it a miracle canteen. Each could feed 5,000 men a day, powered by steam lines and cooled by portable refrigeration coils. What Reinhardt didn't know was that those coils came from the same factories supplying the Normandy front, plants where thousands of civilians worked 12-hour shifts, sealing millions of frozen meals every week. When night came, the prisoners sat in the barracks without a word. Somewhere in the darkness, a man began to hum a hymn from his childhood, and another joined in. It wasn't patriotic, it was mournful. Mueller stared at his untouched bread. The taste of salt lingered on his lips, but it wasn't from the soup. It was the taste of shame, quiet, invisible, spreading like frost through the heart. In war, hunger dehumanizes, but so does being fed by the enemy's compassion. Between the two, some men find their pride melting faster than the ice that once preserved their meals. The next scene unfolds in silence and vapor. Inside a warehouse in Des Moines, Iowa, the air bites harder than any winter wind. Metal walls sweat frost, and pipes hum like a sleeping engine. On the floor, 50 German prisoners shovel crates of frozen vegetables down a conveyor belt that glows under mercury lights. Each crate is stamped U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps, Frozen Foods Division. Among them works Otto Weiss, a former Luftwaffe engineer who once designed cooling systems for aircraft. Now, wearing a wool cap and numbered armband, he studies every valve, every switch. The precision stuns him. A single compressor room hums with enough power to freeze 10 tons of beef in under 90 minutes. Overhead, a foreman from General Electric walks with a clipboard. "Careful near the pipes," he says. "They'll burn your skin, colder than fire." Weiss can't help himself. He sketches the layout on a scrap of packaging paper, marking the circulation lines, the pressure valves, the conveyor timings. That night, in his bunk, he writes, "They're feeding 10 divisions, like clockwork. This is not cooking. This is strategy." The next morning, he stands beside Jim Duffy, an American foreman who had spent 20 years in Chicago's meatpacking district. Duffy notices Weiss staring at a steak frozen so hard it rings when tapped. He grins, grabs a blowtorch, and waves the flame over it for 30 seconds. Steam rises, and the scent of roasted meat fills the room. "You think it loses flavor?" he asks, slicing off a piece. Weiss hesitates, then tastes it. His face softens. "No," he whispers. "It's like time has stopped inside it." Duffy nods. "That's the point. We don't just feed men. We feed moments before they're lost." The engineer feels the ground shift beneath everything he believed about progress. In Germany, machines had been built to destroy time, bombers to outrun it, tanks to erase it. Here, machines preserved it. The freezer wasn't an engine of war, but of foresight. As the camera pulls back, the humming continues, an industrial heartbeat, cold yet alive. Between the breath of frost and the warmth of a shared meal, Weiss begins to understand. America's power was not in reaction, but in prediction, and that, more than any weapon, was terrifying. Winter thickened around the camp, but inside the barracks, something unexpected stirred. It was mail day. After months of silence, permission had finally come for prisoners to send letters home. The guards distributed thin envelopes stamped "Examined by U.S. Army." Men who once shouted orders in battle now sat hunched over rough wooden tables, searching for words that no longer fit their mouths. In one corner, Dr. Karl Reinhardt unfolded his paper carefully. He had treated frostbite on the Eastern Front, stitched wounds in field hospitals buried under snow. Yet this was the first time his hands trembled without cold. He dipped his pen and began, "My dearest Lotte, they feed us 3 times a day. No one starves. The food is plain but kind. I never knew kindness could be cooked. Perhaps that is why they win, not by hate, but by how they treat hunger." He paused, stared at the ink blot spreading like a bruise. In that moment, every rumor he'd ever believed about America, its decadence, its corruption, collapsed under something unbearably simple: decency. Nearby, Sergeant Mueller watched snow gather against the window frame. "Do you think they'll read our letters?" he asked. "Of course," Reinhardt said softly, "but that's not who we're writing for." That night, the camp kitchen was quiet except for the hiss of steam. Dinner was chicken, frozen, fried, fragrant, the same kind they had once ridiculed. As men ate, no one spoke. A few bowed their heads before lifting their spoons. Behind the stove, Corporal Duffy leaned to his friend, whispering, "You can tell when they've changed. They start eating slower." Outside, the wind rattled the tin roof like distant artillery. Inside, only the crackle of food and the sound of pens scratching letters broke the stillness. For the first time, the prisoners weren't eating because they were hungry. They were eating because they finally understood what it meant to be fed. At the end of the night, Reinhardt sealed his envelope. On the back, he wrote one final line: "If war ever ends, I will never waste a warm meal again." To those watching this now, what's the simplest act of care that ever changed your view of someone you once misunderstood? Share it below. History often hides in gestures smaller than a meal. Spring arrived like an apology. Snow melted into mud, and the fences around Camp Atlanta gleamed wet in the sun. The war in Europe was ending. The guards read headlines aloud. Berlin surrounded. Hitler reported dead. For the first time, the camp kitchen slowed. Deliveries thinned. Then one morning, the refrigeration plant shut down. Power rationing. No more cold chain. The officers gathered the prisoners outside. "We're moving the food," one sergeant shouted, "before it spoils." What began as an order turned into a shared labor. Americans and Germans, side by side, lifting boxes of melting meat and vegetables out into the open yard. Steam rose from the thawing packages. It smelled again, like Sunday. Otto Weiss wiped his hands and laughed quietly. "So," he said to Duffy, "this is how your war ends. With a picnic." Duffy grinned. "Could be worse." They built makeshift grills from oil drums, tossing chicken and beef onto the flames. Someone played a harmonica again. For the first time, no one remembered who was prisoner and who was guard. The ice melted not just in the freezers, but in men's eyes. A former German officer raised his tin cup and said, "We mocked frozen food, but maybe it was just waiting for the right warmth." That line spread across the yard, soft as smoke. Reinhardt watched it all, the laughter, the smell of fire, the clatter of spoons, and realized the strange symmetry of it. Machines had kept them alive through cold, but it was human hands that thawed the last barrier. By nightfall, the food was gone. Only ashes and empty crates remained, glistening with frost that hadn't yet vanished. The stars above looked like the crystals once clinging to steel walls. To those listening now, do you think reconciliation begins with words or with the simple act of sharing something warm? Tell me what you believe, because sometimes history's loudest piece begins with silence and the scent of food. 10 years later, Hamburg, 1955. The city had risen from rubble like a man waking after a long illness. Amid its shipyards and warehouses, a small factory stood near the Elbe River. A hand-painted sign above the door read, Nordkool GmbH, Frozen Goods Distribution. Inside, men in white coats moved crates into gleaming metal rooms that hissed faintly with cold. And in the office overlooking them sat Otto Weiss, once a Luftwaffe engineer, once a prisoner of war in America. On his wall hung a faded black and white photograph, himself in 1944, standing beside Jim Duffy inside the Des Moines freezing plant, both smiling awkwardly under plumes of vapor. Beneath the picture, a plaque read, "They froze food, not compassion." Weiss often paused before it at dusk, when the low sun caught the frost on the window panes. In those moments, memory returned. The laughter in the mess hall, the farmer's steady eyes, the taste of hot beef after months of scorn. He had built this business not just to feed a city, but to honor a lesson carved into him by cold air and unexpected kindness. Many of his former fellow prisoners had done the same. Across post-war Europe, ex-POWs who once mocked frozen food opened warehouses, studied refrigeration, and helped rebuild food security in a continent starving not from battle, but from loss. By 1955, more than 100 German-run cold storage companies had emerged, some directly inspired by their experiences in U.S. camps. Weiss kept in touch with Duffy through letters. One of them, dated June 1953, read simply, "Still freezing food, Jim. Still thawing hearts." In Hamburg, the night shift's hum echoed through the corridors. Weiss turned off the office light, leaving only the faint blue glow from the freezer rooms. Outside, the river shimmered like molten steel, alive and endless. He closed the door and whispered a line he had carried for years. The truth that had survived both war and winter. They taught us that warmth can travel through ice. History rarely remembers the temperature of a meal, yet in this story, it defined the boundary between cruelty and civilization. What began as mockery, frozen food served to captives, ended as revelation. The Germans who once laughed at the taste of mechanized cooking discovered that beneath the frost lay something alive, an idea that strength could also be merciful. Across the plains of Nebraska, the hum of diesel generators once sounded like distant artillery. But now, when those same men recalled it, they heard rhythm instead. The steady pulse of a nation that could feed 10 divisions, not because it had to, but because it chose to. Machines that preserved peas and beef had preserved something greater, a belief that humanity, even at war, was worth keeping cold so it wouldn't spoil. Years later, when Otto Weiss opened his small factory by the Elbe, he carried that truth into the post-war world. His freezers were quiet memorials, humming not for profit, but for principle. To him, each frost-covered crate whispered the same paradox that began in that American camp. That warmth could travel through ice, and sometimes compassion required machinery to survive. And so, the story of frozen food became more than industrial progress. It became a quiet sermon on foresight, dignity, and the strange ways people heal. Long after the guns had silenced, the memory of that scent, grilled meat rising into winter air, lingered in those who had once been enemies, reminding them that the line between conqueror and captive can melt, if only long enough for two men to share a meal.